Whenever you visit an amusement park, you might have expectations set for the major coasters. In my opinion, there are three different ways that your expectations could relate to the actual coaster experience. You have the coasters that meet your expectations, the coasters that exceed your expectations, and the type that I'll be discussing today, the coasters that don't live up to your expectations. There are a number of ways that coasters can fail to meet your expectations. It could be the amount of hype surrounding a coaster. It could be an element that you weren't impressed with. It could be the smoothness of the ride. Taking these factors and more into account, I have thought of 10 coasters that I thought were overrated and failed to meet my expectations. Before I get into the top 10, here are a few honorable mentions. The first one is Tatsu at Six Flags Magic Mountain. I only got one ride on this back in 2018, but it ended up being my least favorite B&M flyer I've ridden. I still stand by that to this day. The reason why I personally preferred Manta at SeaWorld Orlando and the two Superman clones I've ridden over it is because I felt like Tatsu was a bit too intense for me to really enjoy. However, I can see why you'd have Tatsu as your favorite flying coaster if it isn't too much for you. Next up is Alpengeist at Busch Gardens, Williamsburg. Before my first trip to this park in 2021, I heard a lot of people say this is their favorite B&M invert, even over rides like Montu and Raptor. I personally prefer the aforementioned inverts over Alpengeist, and I even prefer a polished chariot in the same park. That being said, Alpengeist is still really good, and this keeps it off the list. Shockwave at Six Flags Over Texas is another coaster that I only did once, but I didn't do it in the back row, which by all accounts is the best row for this ride. Next time I go to Six Flags Over Texas, I'll make sure to try it in the back row and give it a fair judgment, but until then, I cannot call Shockwave overrated. Finally, we have Goliath at Six Flags Over Georgia. When I rode this for my first time back in 2017, I thought this was my favorite coaster I had ridden. I thought the airtime was fantastic, and the downwards helix was super intense. My 2021 ride was just as good as it was in 2017. Despite this, not too long after my trip to Six Flags Over Georgia, I started to hear a lot of people say it's the best B&M hyper in the country because most of the hills supposedly had ejector airtime. I didn't think it had ejector airtime like many people say it did, but then again, my ride on Goliath was fairly early in the day with a half-full train, so maybe it was just running slow. I bet it would be much better with a full train later in the day, but because I've never had a bad ride on Goliath, it's just an honorable mention. Now let's kick off the top 10. Number 10, Viper. This in-house wooden coaster was sadly a fall from grace for me, as I deemed this ride underrated after my 2019 rides on it. I thought the airtime was really good back then, and it was running quite smooth. My 2021 ride was a complete 180. There was no airtime, and it was also way rougher than before. One of the turns was so jerky that I slammed my head into someone else's elbow, so I had a headache for the rest of the ride. Viper was in my top 5 in the park after that 2019 trip, but after my terrible ride on it in 2021, it's barely in my top 10 in the park. I'm still hearing people say it's one of their favorite coasters in the park, and I don't see how they can think that if it ran like that in my 2021 ride. Because of how far it dropped after my 2021 ride, that's why Viper made the list. But it's a bit lower on the list because I've gotten more good rides on it than bad rides. Number 9. Magnum XL200. The original hypercoaster takes the number 9 spot on this list because of the hype. Even though Magnum seems to be a polarizing coaster among enthusiasts, more seem to love it than hate it. Some would even go as far as to put this in the top 2 or 3 coasters at Cedar Point, which I think is insane. After my 2016 ride on it, along with my first 2021 ride on it, I had this as the worst coaster in the park due to how painful the airtime was. I wasn't even sitting in the magic seat on either of those rides, but rather the very front row. Both of those front row rides hurt my thighs so much to the point where I considered it as one of the top 2 worst coasters I had ridden. However, I decided to give the back row a shot because I had heard from numerous videos, especially those from Airtime Thrills, that the airtime in the back row was less violent and more sustained than it was up front. That was accurate, those rumors. On top of that, I actually got to ride in the back row with Airtime Thrills himself. He happened to be at Cedar Point on my 3rd day back in 2021, so I got the chance to experience Magnum with him. That back row ride was one of my favorite coaster rides of 2021. Not only because I got the chance to ride it with Airtime Thrills, but also because I finally got to enjoy Magnum without getting my thighs hurt. That being said, I still haven't ranked near the middle of Cedar Point's coaster lineup, not top 2 or 3 like I hear so often. So that's why Magnum made the list. I do have it lower because I respect the ride for what it is. Plus, I can't justify putting the coaster that gave me one of my favorite coaster rides of 2021 extremely high on the list. That would just be wrong. Number 8, Afterburn. This was one of my new for 2022 credits, and the only one you'll see on this list. Over the past few years, I've heard tons of people call Afterburn the most intense B&M invert. With a reputation like that, I had high hopes for this ride going in. I even projected it to be my number 2 invert after Montu. After my first ride out front, I was super disappointed. I thought that each of the elements fell flat. I much preferred Montu, Raptor, and even Alpengeist to it. However, there was hardly anybody on the train, so I'm sure it was just a slow ride. I made sure to try the back row the next day to see if Afterburn could redeem itself. I got that back row ride I needed, but this time with the full train. I thought it was better, but just a little bit. I thought the final corkscrew was way better than before, but for the most part, I thought the other versions rode fairly similar to my front row ride. Because of this, Afterburn takes the number 8 spot on this list. Number 7, Griffin. This is considered by many to be the best B&M dive coaster out there. After 3 rides, I actually thought that this is my least favorite of the 3 I've done. I've done Griffin, SheiKra, and Valravn as of when I'm recording this, and I thought Griffin was by far the weakest of the 3. I didn't get the same airtime on the first drop that I got on SheiKra's first drop, even from the back row. I also thought the inversions didn't really do anything for me. That being said, the hills before the splashdown and before the final brake run surprised me, as I didn't see them coming. Despite those 2 elements being really good, I thought the rest of the ride was disappointing. Another factor as to why Griffin is my least favorite dive coaster is the smoothness. On my first 2 rides, it was glossy smooth like everyone said it was, even on the far left outside seat. I don't know what happened on my 3rd ride. The ride was a lot rougher than it was a few days prior, and I was sitting in the exact same seat too. I actually got a bit of head banging in the second half, and this didn't happen on the first few rides. I think Griffin might have just been having a bad day, but the roughness on my final ride solidified this as my least favorite dive coaster, putting it on the list. Number 6, Mindblower. The worst coaster I've ever ridden as of when I'm recording this is next on the hot seat. This ride is brutally rough like everyone said it was. I couldn't even tolerate one front row ride on it, as each of the valleys caused tons of bad jackhammering. I couldn't enjoy this ride because of it. Whenever I hear about Mindblower, everyone says that it has some great airtime despite the roughness. From my experience, in no way is that accurate. I didn't leave my seat once on this ride since I got stapled by the operator in the station. Then again, even if I did have room, I think the airtime would have been irrelevant since I couldn't look past the roughness of this ride. Now I'm just worried about Hades 360 since I've heard from some that it's way worse than Mindblower and double the length. Many people say they enjoy Mindblower despite the roughness, and I don't see how. That's why Mindblower makes this list. If you hate extreme roughness, stay away from this ride. Number 5, Mystic Timbers. I know that this may be the most controversial coaster to include on the list, as everyone else seems to worship this ride. Here's why I think it's overrated. During my first 2 rides in 2020, I got stapled at the bottom of the first drop, so I got no airtime at all. I didn't consider it overrated back then, as I knew I needed to try it again with some room to see if I can get any airtime. I got my chance to try it again in 2021, and the same thing happened on most of my rides. There were only 2 or so rides that I managed to successfully get airtime, and as of when I'm recording this, I've gotten 8 rides on Mystic Timbers. I hear many people say it has ejector airtime on every single hill. I personally think that's a load of hogwash. The airtime I got was weak. However, I did not try holding up the lap bar, so maybe if I did that next time I go to Kings Island, I'll be able to see why everyone loves it. But for now, Mystic Timbers is towards the middle of the pack out of the coasters at Kings Island. I hear people calling this the best ride in the park, and I don't buy that. Because the airtime strength was way overhyped, Mystic Timbers cracked the top 5 on this list. Thankfully, it is really smooth though. It would be higher if it was rougher than advertised. Number 4, Raging Bull. I know what you're probably thinking. Are you serious? This ride is underrated. Not in my opinion. I thought each and every element was a dud on this ride. Yup, even the first drop. Everyone says Raging Bull has the best first drop on a B&M Hyper, but for me, there was no airtime. At first, you may think I did not ride the very back row with a significant amount of airtime room. I did. This element still gave me nothing. Without question, this is the most overrated coaster element I've ever experienced. The rest of the ride from the back row did nothing except meander around. I decided to try the front row to see how it compared to the back row, and to be honest with you, I thought they were actually really close in terms of quality. That's not showing you how good the front row was, but rather how lame the back row was. On top of the lame ride experience, this coaster seemed to have started getting praised out of nowhere, as now I'm hearing multiple people say it's one of the best B&M Hypers out there. Based on my recent rides, I couldn't disagree more. I think Raging Bull does not deserve any of the praise it gets. After my trip to the park in 2019, I preferred American Eagle to Raging Bull. Granted, I hadn't tried the back row on Raging Bull at the time yet, but after disappointed I was after trying it in 2021, and after how incredible American Eagle was running the same year, I feel like my opinion from 2019 was solidified. I even preferred rides like Batman, Superman, X-Flight, and even Wizard over Raging Bull. Because of the elements being overhyped, and everyone seeming to go nuts over this ride for no good reason, I have Raging Bull in the top 4 on this list. Number 3, X2. If you were to ask me what the top 2 coasters of Six Flags Magic Mountain are, I'd say it's Twisted Colossus and Superman Escape from Krypton. Most other people would choose X2 as the other coaster in this park's top 2, along with Twisted Colossus, for a few reasons. For one, it's the only large-scale 4D coaster in the country, outside of S&S Free Spins, so it's a unique ride experience to America. At first, I can understand that, but then you lose me whenever I hear people say X2 is an enjoyable ride. Seriously? X2 is not enjoyable at all. Okay, I will admit, it does have an incredible first drop. It's easily the best element on the ride and one of the best elements I've ever experienced. Plus, the view from the lift hill was outstanding, especially since I rode it at sunset. I also got the fire effect at the end as well, but that didn't add anything to the ride, and unfortunately the on-ride soundtrack was broken. Despite those parts of the ride I just mentioned, I didn't enjoy X2 at all. The track is rough, it's incredibly jerky, and it was overall a painful experience. I was also on the inside seat too, which is supposedly the smoothest seat on the ride, but that didn't help at all. At the time when I had ridden it, I deemed X2 as the roughest steel coaster I had ridden. I have since ridden a steel coaster that is way rougher than X2, and we'll get to that coaster in a bit. I always hear people say they're excited to ride X2 whenever they visit Magic Mountain for the first time, and I don't get the hype for this ride. It seems like nobody hardly says anything about Twisted Colossus these days, and in my opinion, that coaster should get all the hype, not X2. Number 2, Steel Vengeance. Steel Vengeance seems to have become yet another polarizing coaster recently. There are several people who say that Steel Vengeance is the greatest coaster ever built and that nothing comes close, and there are also several people who think it's not as good as advertised. I definitely fit into the latter. I think this coaster is nowhere near the best one ever built. I got 5 rides on it in July of 2021, and I was expecting a lot more from this ride. Even from a back row night ride, I was underwhelmed. Most of the elements were either decent or a total dud, and don't even get me started with the giant outer bank in the first half. This element right here is easily the most overrated part of the ride. I was expecting standing ejector airtime the whole time like everyone else said it had, but I got next to nothing. No matter where I sat, this element didn't do it for me. I will say that the first drop and first zero deal were elite, along with the double up before the mid-course. While the first half did have some good elements, the second half was mostly full of duds, with the exception of the finale. That did have some decent airtime, unlike the rest of the second half, but it still wasn't world-class like I expected. Now I'm starting to think I might have just caught Steel Vengeance at a bad time. From what I've heard from many people, the mid-course rarely trims, especially at night. But on each of my 5 rides, the trim trimmed hard each time. Just look how slow it's exiting the mid-course in this shot. It trimmed that hard every single ride I got. It made it so I got next to no airtime throughout the entire second half besides the finale. The head chop drop didn't give that much airtime, as did the double up before it. Along with the finale being good, I thought the other good element in the second half was the third inversion. That was a really snappy inversion. Despite the 2 elements in the second half being good, along with the elements I mentioned in the first half that I really enjoyed, I just can't understand when people say Steel Vengeance is the best coaster of all time based off of my rides. Maybe if I get a ride without the mid-course trim in the train, I'd be able to better understand what everyone is talking about. But for me, Steel Vengeance is my number 4 coaster at Cedar Point. I have Top Thrill Dragster, Maverick, and Millennium Force ranked higher than it. I think some other factors that make me rank this ride lower on my personal list are the stupid locker policy and especially no row requests. It feels like you're going through TSA to ride Steel Vengeance with the $2 lockers outside the queue, and then you're likely to get your row request denied on this ride. I asked to wait extra for the back row on a few of my rides, but my request got denied, and I got assigned row 9 the first time and then row 8 the second time. That only added salt to the wound. Queue experience aside, the non-stop weaker airtime moments along with the hype put this coaster in number 2 on this list. While this coaster is advertised to have the most airtime of any coaster in the world, I personally think that the Voyage, which is coaster that Steel Vengeance took the record from, has more airtime. Number 1, Kumba. Don't even get me started with this ride. Remember the 3 ways I mentioned at the beginning in which coasters can fail to meet your expectations? Well, Kumba is the only one on this list that checks all 3 of those boxes. The first 9 coasters on this list checked 1 or 2 of them. For a long time, I heard everyone say Kumba is smooth and extremely intense with some of the best elements on any coaster with its zero-G roll and Cobra roll. I'm sorry if you're one of those people, but you're just wrong. Kumba was extremely forceless, even from the very back row on a hot summer evening. Both of the aforementioned elements did nothing for me, as did the rest of the ride. And on top of that, Kumba was extremely rough. I first rode this ride in 2021, and I thought it was one of the roughest coasters I've ever ridden. I was on the ride outside seat in the front row, and my right ear was bruised, even though I was riding defensively. I did 2 more rides on the inner seat a few days later, and those were a tad smoother, but those rides show me that the elements fell flat. Fast forward to 2022 when I came back to Busch Gardens Tampa to ride Iron Gwazi. I had just ridden the Incredible Hulk coaster a few days prior, and I thought it was way more intense than Kumba was. I always hear people say Kumba is way more intense than Hulk, and I don't see how. During my one day at the park in 2022, I gave Kumba another try, mainly to see how lame it was compared to Hulk. Let me just say, saying the ride was lame was a major understatement. In fact, it was way worse than last year. Several of the valleys caused the train to shake violently from side to side, and that resulted in my head getting smashed against the restraint, one hit after another. It was not riding like that in 2021. Given how rough my 2021 rides were, especially my first one, I was forced to ride way more defensively than I ever have on any coaster. That didn't help with this ride. How does one coaster get so much rougher from year to year? It doesn't make sense. The ride was also running a lot slower this year than it did last year. It was taking the inversions too fast to provide hang time, and too slow to provide any sort of positives or whip. When I first heard those rumors about Kumba getting removed, I had not yet got my 2022 ride, and I thought the park should keep it around, mainly because of how good it looks. After my 2022 ride on it, I really want Busch Gardens Tampa to remove this ride. It may look good, but it does not ride good at all. Kumba is easily my least favorite coaster in the park. Yes, I even prefer Air Grover to this ride. Combine the forceless inversions and an unbearably rough ride experience that causes your head to play pinball against the restraint, even with the most offensive riding. These make Kumba an easy choice for number 1 on this list. Kumba? More like Bad. Good riddance. There you have it. As of July of 2022, these are the 10 most overrated coasters I've ridden. I know there are some coasters featured in this video that you may not agree with, especially rides like Griffin and especially Mystic Timbers. I hope I didn't make anyone too frustrated with this list, but if I did, I apologize. Just know that these are just my opinions, and all I ask is that you respect my opinions, even if you disagree with me. I know that a lot of people hold each of these coasters to high regard, and if you're one of those people, I'm totally cool with that. Even though I don't have these rides ranked as high as many others do, it doesn't mean that I hate all of them. I do enjoy some of these rides for what they are, especially Steel Vengeance and Afterburn. The thing is, I just can't justify ranking these coasters as high as others do based off of how my experience was on these rides. Now that you know what the most overrated coasters I've ridden are, I want to know what some of the most overrated coasters you've ridden are. Be sure to post your comments below about what coasters you think are overrated. And as always, before you click off of this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and hit the bell to turn on all notifications so you don't miss out on any future uploads. I plan to make a video in which I'll be stating my most underrated coasters I've ridden as a flip side of this video, so stay tuned for that one. And until then, I'll see you guys later.